So let's have a look at what is happening in the Middle East. And what we have to appreciate is the artificial nature of the borders between many of these nations. They were carved out during the First World War and were quite arbitrary. And the two people that gave the impetus to where those lines should be are Sykes and Picot, who during the World War I got their heads together to decide how they were going to divide up the Middle East when they had pushed the Turk out of the region. And it is into this region that we now have this modern phenomena. I certainly wasn't talking about it at the prophecy day in February, of this Islamic State, which has plonked itself across the borders spanning Iraq and Syria. And it has been so remarkable to see the emergence of this power in such a short period of time. So let's have a little look at that. And before we do, we need to have a look at another map. This map outlines the difference between the two main religious powers, the Shia and the Sunnis. Iran is 90% Shia, Iraq is 63% Shia. The rest are Sunni, with Saudi Arabia is 95%, Egypt 90%, Turkey 85%, Syria 74%, and Yemen about 65%. So, two main broad divisions. ISIS spans across the divisions there. ISIS is actually Sunni, but not friendly to the rest of the Sunni nations in the Middle East. They want to control Shia and the other Sunnis. So ISIS has gone through various transformations. It was set up originally in 2004 as a support for Al-Qaeda when America and Britain were invading and dealing with Saddam Hussein. This power came together to help the Sunnis in Iraq. But there was a falling out, and they became independent in 2013, last year, and have gone from strength to strength. And they're either known as ISIS, which is the Islamic State in Iraq or Syria, or instead of Syria, Sham, which is an ancient name for Syria, or they're known as ISIL, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, Levant being the name of the area there. But now, in the past 3 months, they have changed and said that we don't want to be known by ISIS or ISIL, but by IS, which makes it a bit difficult to say. My spell checker doesn't like it at all. But it's now known as the Islamic State. And as I say, they are Sunni Muslims, but not friendly with the rest of the Sunni population. It's interesting too that Saddam Hussein and his henchmen were mainly Sunnis. Now this is a quotation from The Guardian back in June. It soon became clear that in less than 3 years, ISIS has grown from a ragtag band of extremists to perhaps the most cash-rich and capable terror group in the world. And that has been echoed many times since, that ISIS are a very rich terrorist group. When they took over Mosul, they robbed the banks and got $1.5 million. They are looting archaeological sites, and this $36 million was just from one site, and there are many sites which they have looted and sold the treasures on the Western markets. They get $3 million profit a day from the Syrian oil fields which they have captured, and the amount of money they get in ransoms is unknown, but very high sums of money. So they're very rich. They use brutal Sharia law to terrorise the people. We've seen many examples of hand chopping, chopping off heads, hangings, crucifixions, beheadings. And this absolutely terrorises the people that are under threat. So that, for instance, when they took Mosul, the soldiers just fled because they knew what their fate would be. In fact, many of them were marched out into the desert and just shot in cold blood, very reminiscent of the Nazis. They're very similar to the ancient Assyrians. If you look at ancient Assyrian monuments, you see they did exactly the same thing, chopping off the heads, putting out of eyes, flaying people, hang them up on spikes and that kind of thing. I don't recommend you buy this book. It came out in 2009, Extreme Violence and the Visuals and Text of Antiquity. It's in German anyway. But it was interesting conclusion. Physical violence is a universal in all cultures, this new history book concludes. Whether we'll ever see any improvements is hard to say, considering mankind's history to date. And when we read in Scripture of the latter days, of Jerusalem being besieged and women raped and girls being sold as sex slaves and these kind of things which we read in Scriptures, we used to shake our heads and think, well, that couldn't happen in this 21st century. But it does, in Africa, here, and around the world. These things go on. So, is the Islamic State here to stay? Or is it like the Muslim Brotherhood, which seemed to be a great power up to 18 months ago, and now it has almost been wiped off the map? Well, it's hard to say. Currently, Obama has reversed his policies, and he has said that he is going to deal with this situation and intervene in Iraq, providing air power. But he says the boots on the ground have got to come from the local Arab nations. And they're very loath to actually do that. Egypt has said, I'm very sorry, our constitution forbids us to do that. Turkey has said, no, we don't want to work with the Americans. Iran hasn't been asked, and Iran has said, well, even if we were asked, we wouldn't work with the Americans. And Syria has said, any American aircraft that come, we'll knock them down. And America has said, well, if you do that, we'll destroy your air force. So it's probably going to be down to Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and it'll be interesting to see just how effective they are. But it doesn't look as if the Islamic State is going to disappear in a short period of time. Now, the reading which we took, I think, gives us a relevant clue. We're just going to look at it in a moment, but before we get there, I just want to say a few words about Muhammad, the Mohammedans, and the Bible. There have been several voices within our community and those associated with our community saying, look, it's the Arabs, they're Gog, they are the beast, they're going to be the ones that make war with Israel and the Lamb. But the Bible makes it clear that Israel's great enemy is not the Arabs, but false Christianity. And that is rooted right in the whole of the New Testament, many prophecies about that. And the idea that the name Muhammad adds up to 666, and so this is the beast of Revelation chapter 13, isn't true. It adds up to 92. And this idea that it does add up to 666 actually comes from a Roman Catholic who was seeking to divert attention away from the true understanding of who the number 666 refers to. And he came up with this idea that Muhammad had a strange name which does actually add up to 666, and he quotes various ancient sources to prove that. But actually, if you examine those sources, that isn't the case. Muhammad didn't use this term Mumitis, which does add up to 666. So we can say that we're trying to prove that this ISIS power is the beast system, and we're on very shaky ground. So ISIS sits between Syria and Iraq, marked out by these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it sits across there. Incidentally, President Obama said last week that the Islamic State isn't Islamist. Nobody can really understand what he's getting at, because it very definitely is an Islamist state. One of its main cities is Mosul up in the north, which it conquered. And very interestingly, Mosul is up there, is the site of Nineveh. If you go into Google Earth, you'll see there the Nineveh ruins. So Mosul is where Nineveh was. This was the capital of the ancient Assyrian Empire. We're told in Genesis chapter 10 that Nimrod went out and went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Era and Calah. So this was one of the cities that Nimrod built, and Nineveh became the centre, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Asher, from where he went out, is also on the Tigris and is just in the Is territory at the moment. But from Asher we get Assyria. So the prophecy that we read from Numbers chapter 24, we didn't read the opening verse all the way back in verse 7, which talks about Israel's king, in verse 7, being higher than Agag. His kingdom shall be exalted. That's the end glorious picture, that Israel has a king who's going to be greater than Agag. Probably aware that the Septuagint version translates Agag, which is the title of the Amalekites, as Gog. So it's talking about a latter-day Amalekite system. Now, the Amalekites were a nation that sought to destroy Israel as they journeyed out of Egypt. And so we look for a latter-day Amalekite power, a power that is opposed to Israel, who is linked with Agag or Gog, and we have that power described so elegantly in Ezekiel chapter 38 that comes down against Israel, the latter-day Amalekite. But in describing how this power is going to be broken and perish forever, it gives us some locations. It talks about, in verse 24, about ships coming from the coast of Kittim shall afflict Asher, shall afflict Eber, and he, Amalek, Agag, shall perish forever. Now, we understand as Gog comes down with his many ships, as Daniel speaks about, from his Black Sea bases, down through the Dardanelles, having taken Turkey, so her ships can freely go through, and it makes sense that she takes Cyprus or Kittim. This is where Britain has her bases. And if you're going to take Israel and Egypt and the Middle East, then that is one of the places you have to take, possess that. And from there, it then says he takes Asher, which is over there where Assyria is. So what this points to is that there is a power in the Middle East which is unfriendly to Gog, to Russia. And we know that at that time, from Ezekiel 38, that Iran, Persia, will be on the side of Gog. And so it wouldn't make sense to come across here to take this power of Asher that is opposed to Iran, opposed to Gog, unless there is some power there that needs taking. And from there, he then goes down into Egypt and takes Egypt before coming back up and taking Eber. Eber, we believe, is an ancient name of Hebrew, is a descendant of Eber. It is a cryptic description of Israel. So in order to take Israel, he's got to take Egypt as a southern flank, he's got to take Asher as a northern flank, and Cyprus as an eastern flank. So it would point that there is a power there that isn't on the side of Iran, isn't on the side of Russia. So that would point to the fact that IS is there to stay until it is taken. We shall see whether that is the fulfilment or whether there is some other solution to the conundrum. We know how Iran has been asserting her influence in the region, very much so in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. She's also been meddling in Iraq and in Syria, and recently Turkey and Iran have renewed their ties which have been broken. And we can see that to the north of Israel, a regrouping under Iran of nations who are working together, but plonked in the middle of them is this power which is opposed to them, this Islamic State. Now, to the south, we have the Gulf Confederation, the Gulf Council. And they're wanting to build the equivalent of the EU in the Gulf by these independent states working together. They have been working together for quite a number of years, but they want to intensify that. And they're talking about having an army, a common army of 100,000 men by this time next year. They're also reaching out to bring Jordan into this confederacy, and we know how they have been helping Egypt, as Egypt has thrown out the Muslim Brotherhood, who were opposed by Saudi Arabia, and under the new ruler, under Sisi, they are being supported by the Gulf states. And so we're seeing, a bringing together of nations there, and we believe, and we shall look at how Israel too is being drawn into this southern alliance. The problem at the moment is Yemen. Yemen is very much Al-Qaeda territory and is fighting against Saudi Arabia, and yet Yemen is where Sheba, the original Sheba, was, and we know that in Ezekiel 38, Sheba and Dedan are working together. But America is working very hard to deal with insurgency. Yemen is supposed to join the Gulf Cooperation Council next year, but that's highly doubtful at the moment. But that is the wish, and I think we shall see that she will eventually be drawn into this. So if we revisit the map, we have, the EU and Russia butting up against each other, and we have Iran exerting her influences there, apart from this IS power at the moment. And to the south, we have Saudi Arabia working her magic to try and build people together. And I believe this is all part of one picture, that when the time comes for, as I say, Europe and Russia to put their differences on one side, to come together, they will have Iran on their side. So, and having come down into Constantinople, Russia then will be the king of the north and be opposed to these powers, with America and Britain playing their role in the south. Eventually, Egypt will be lopped off, and eventually Israel will be lopped off, and the king of the north will have power over those territories. So let's have a look at Israel. As we're aware, there has been a long battle with Hamas, and Netanyahu summed up the whole thing, saying there is a realignment of forces in the Middle East based on a common concern with the dangers posed by radical Islamic terrorists. I'd like to translate this understanding into cooperation and peace between Israel and our Palestinian neighbours. And indeed, Israel is seeking to supply gas to Jordan, and is quite advanced in talks to supply gas to Egypt. She's wanting to make friends with her neighbours and to build trade between the nations. The foe that Israel faces in Hamas is the same common foe that the other Arab nations face. What the world is just waking up to is that what Israel has been saying for years, that Hamas is really no different from Al-Qaeda, is really no different from now ISIS. They all seek a common state, the elimination of Christianity and Jews, and not being satisfied with small countries. They want to expand their caliphates out to large areas. And they're prepared to use any means to gain their goals. And as somebody put it last week, Hamas is ISIS light. It's just a different version of ISIS.